The fearless alien girl. Cyra had never known fear. From the moment she was born, she had been trained to be a warrior. Her people, the Drex, were one of the most feared species in the galaxy. They believed that fear was weakness, and weakness had no place in their world. For years, Cyra had fought in battles, watching countless species crumble before the power of the Drex. She never hesitated. She never doubted. She never felt fear. Now she stood on a barren ridge, looking down at a ruined human colony. Smoke rose from burning buildings, and the smell of destruction filled the air. The Drex had attacked only a few hours ago, and most of the human defenders were already dead. Cyra narrowed her glowing yellow eyes. This was what always happened. Weak species fell. Strong species ruled. But her mission was not to fight today. She was sent to observe the humans, to understand their weaknesses before the final invasion. She turned to her squad leader, Commander Varric, a massive Drek warrior covered in black armor. "The humans fought harder than expected," Varric said, his voice deep and cold. "They are stubborn, but their defeat is certain. You will watch them, study them, and report back. But remember this, these creatures are nothing compared to us. They will fall like all the others." Cyra nodded. She knew her duty. The Drex never lost. A human who refused to die. As the sun began to set, Cyra moved through the ruins, her armor blending into the shadows. She had expected to find only dying humans, broken and weak. Instead, she found something else. A lone human soldier stood in the middle of a destroyed street, facing an entire squad of Drek warriors. His uniform was torn, his face covered in blood and dirt. He was injured, outnumbered, and had no chance of survival. But he did not surrender. Cyra crouched on a rooftop, watching with interest. The soldier, his name was written on his armor, Captain Elias Kane, held a broken weapon in his hands. He should have run. He should have begged for his life. That was what most species did when they saw the Drex. But Elias stood his ground. One of the Drek warriors, a tall and brutal fighter named Threx, stepped forward. "Human, you are finished. Surrender." Elias wiped the blood from his mouth and gave a small, tired smile. "No." Cyra tilted her head. "No." Threx growled. "You are alone. You cannot win." Elias let out a short laugh. "Winning isn't always about surviving." Then, without warning, he attacked. Cyra's eyes widened as the human moved with shocking speed, using every last ounce of his strength. He fought with everything he had, dodging, striking, refusing to fall. He was weaker, slower, and outmatched. And yet, he did not stop. One by one, the Drex struck him down, blow after blow. Yet Elias kept standing back up. Cyra felt something strange in her chest, something she had never felt before. Why wasn't he giving up? Why was he still fighting? She had seen warriors before, but none like this. He should have feared death. He should have begged for mercy. But he didn't. And for the first time in her life, Cyra felt uneasy, a question she could not answer. Finally, Elias could no longer stand. He collapsed, breathing heavily, his body refusing to move. Threx stood over him, raising his blade. "You should have surrendered." Elias coughed, looking up with defiant eyes. "You first." Cyra felt something twist inside her. This human should be broken. He should be afraid. But he wasn't. For years, Cyra believed that fear was weakness, that the strongest were the ones who never felt it. But now, as she looked at Elias Kane, broken, bleeding, yet still fighting, she realized something. Maybe fear wasn't weakness. Maybe fear was something else. Something powerful. And for the first time in her life, Cyra felt afraid. The human who would not die. Cyra had seen death before. She had watched species fall under the might of the Drex. She had seen warriors kneel, their spirits crushed before their bodies. She had witnessed the destruction of entire civilizations, and none of it had ever moved her. But now, standing in the ruins of this human city, she felt something strange. She felt uncertain. The human, Captain Elias Kane, should have been dead. The battle was over. His people had fallen. And yet he had refused to kneel. He had refused to surrender, even when there was no chance of survival. Now he lay motionless on the ground, his body broken, his breaths slow and ragged. The Dreks stood around him, their weapons dripping with blood, their armor reflecting the flames of the burning city. Commander Varric approached, his black armor making him look like a shadow against the firelit sky. He looked down at Elias, his expression one of disgust. "This one lasted longer than expected," Varric said. "But in the end, he is just like the others." Cyra wasn't sure if that was true. He didn't seem like the others. Threx, the warrior who had fought Elias, raised his blade for the final strike. "Shall I finish him, Commander?" Varric barely glanced at the human. "Do it." Cyra watched as Threx raised his weapon higher. Her heart pounded. She didn't understand why, but something in her mind screamed that this was wrong. The decision that changed everything. Before she could stop herself, Cyra spoke. "Wait." The word came out sharp, like a command. The other Dreks turned to her, surprised. Even Varric narrowed his eyes. Cyra stepped forward, her face calm, but her mind racing. This human survived longer than expected. If we kill him now, we lose valuable information. Threx frowned. "He's weak. What more do we need to know?" Cyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "If a weak species can fight like this, we need to understand why." Varric studied her, silent for a long moment. Cyra kept her posture straight, refusing to show hesitation. She had to be careful. Finally, Varric nodded. "Fine. Take him to the outpost. See what you can learn. If he dies on the way, leave him." Cyra let out a slow breath. She had done it. Threx muttered under his breath but obeyed, lifting Elias's barely conscious body and throwing him over his shoulder. The human groaned in pain but did not speak. Cyra followed as they headed back to the Drek transport ships. She didn't know why she had stopped them from killing him. All she knew was that something about this human terrified her. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to look away. Survival against the odds. The Drek outpost was built deep inside the ruins of the human city, a massive metallic structure rising above the destruction. Elias was thrown into a containment cell, the cold steel walls pressing in around him. His breathing was uneven, his body barely holding together. Cyra stood outside, watching. She told herself she was studying him, that this was just part of the mission. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. This was something else. A few hours passed, and yet Elias did not die. Despite his wounds, despite the pain, he clung to life with a stubbornness that defied logic. Finally, he stirred. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharp. When he saw Cyra standing outside his cell, he smiled. Cyra felt her stomach twist. "You again," Elias rasped. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Figured I'd see you before I died." Cyra didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. Elias took a slow, painful breath and gave her a look that made her uneasy. He wasn't afraid. Not of her. Not of death. Not of anything. "How are you still alive?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. Elias smirked weakly. "Wouldn't be much of a soldier if I gave up easy." Cyra narrowed her eyes. "You were outnumbered. You had no chance." Elias gave a tired chuckle. "Yeah, I noticed." Cyra clenched her fists. Why was he making jokes? He should be broken. He should be begging for mercy. Instead, he acted like he had already won. She turned away, walking toward the exit. But before she left, she heard him speak again. "You ever been afraid before?" Cyra froze. Slowly, she turned back to him. "Fear is weakness. Elias tilted his head. Is it? She didn't answer. She didn't know how to. Without another word, she left the room, her mind racing. For the first time in her life, she had no answers. And that terrified her more than anything. The unthinkable choice. Cyra had always believed she was strong. She had fought in countless battles, seen planets crumble under the might of her people, and never once had she hesitated. But now, standing outside the human cell, her mind refused to stay silent. Elias Kane should have been dead. Any other species would have broken by now. His wounds were severe, his body pushed beyond its limits. Yet every time she checked on him, he was still alive, still breathing, still looking at her with that maddening defiance in his eyes. She told herself she was only observing him, that this was part of her mission. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't studying him. She was trying to understand him. The question that changed everything. Days passed, and Elias refused to die. His wounds should have killed him, but he clung to life with a stubbornness that defied reason. Cyra spent more time in the observation room, watching through the glass as he sat in his cell. Sometimes he spoke. "Come on, you're staring at me like I'm a lab experiment. Do I look that interesting?" She ignored him. Other times, he asked her questions she had no answers to. "You ever been afraid before?" No. That was the answer she wanted to give, but something inside her refused to let her say it. Now, as she entered the room for another round of questioning, Elias smirked. His face was bruised, his arms still bandaged, but his spirit was unshaken. "Back for more," he said, leaning back against the cold wall. "Starting to think you like my company." Cyra didn't react. "How are you still alive?" Elias exhaled, shaking his head. "You Drex really don't get it, do you?" Cyra frowned. "Get what?" "That humans don't break the way you think they do." He winced slightly as he shifted. "You've seen us fight. You've seen us lose, but you don't understand why we keep fighting." Cyra narrowed her glowing yellow eyes. "You fight because you have no choice." Elias laughed, actually laughed. It was weak, rough, but filled with something Cyra couldn't place. "No," he said, "we fight because we choose to, because giving up isn't an option." Cyra stared at him. He wasn't lying. He truly believed that. For the first time, she wondered, what if he was right? Betrayal begins with a thought. That night, Cyra couldn't sleep. She lay in her barracks, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment she had seen Elias fight. Every time he had stood back up when he should have stayed down. Every time he had refused to surrender. Her people had always said that fear was weakness. That strength came from being unshaken, unbreakable. But Elias had been afraid. He had felt fear. She had seen it in his eyes. And yet he had kept fighting. Her breath came faster as a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if we were wrong? She sat up abruptly, shaking her head. No, the Drex were never wrong. Fear was weakness. But as she closed her eyes, all she could see was Elias's face, bruised and broken, but undefeated. The moment of no return. The next day, something changed. Cyra entered the outpost control room to find Commander Varric standing before a holographic screen, and Elias's face was displayed on it. "We've learned what we can from the human," Varric said coldly. "He is stubborn, but ultimately, his kind are no different from the others." Cyra remained silent, her hands clenched behind her back. "We have received new orders," Varric continued. "The final invasion begins in 3 cycles. This outpost will be dismantled, and all prisoners will be executed." Cyra's pulse quickened. "Executed." "Understood," one of the officers responded. Varric turned to her. "You will handle the human. Dispose of him before we leave." Cyra's mind went blank. She had killed before. She had followed orders without question. So why, now, did her body refuse to move? She forced herself to nod. "Yes, Commander." But as she left the room, her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she wasn't going to do it, a choice that could not be undone. That night, Cyra stood outside Elias's cell, her heart pounding. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, looking exhausted but still alive, still fighting. She took a deep breath and did something unthinkable. She pressed a button, and the cell door slid open. Elias didn't move at first. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked. Cyra met his gaze. "You need to leave." Elias exhaled sharply. "Just like that." She nodded. "Just like that." Elias studied her. He knew what this meant. "If they catch you." "I know," she interrupted. Silence stretched between them. Cyra knew this was treason. If the Drex found out, she would be branded a traitor. She would be hunted. But she couldn't let him die. Finally, Elias pushed himself up. He swayed slightly but stayed on his feet. He looked her in the eyes and nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's get the hell out of here." Cyra exhaled and stepped aside, allowing him to walk past her. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. Surviving together. Cyra had spent her entire life believing that humans were weak. Now she was risking everything to save one. The Drek outpost was silent, the cold steel walls humming with distant energy as she led Elias through the corridors. He moved slowly, his body battered and exhausted, but his spirit remained unbroken. Cyra had seen warriors fight for their survival before, but she had never seen anyone fight like him. And now, for the first time in her life, she was running with someone instead of hunting them. A dangerous escape. The halls were dimly lit, the blue glow of energy panels casting long shadows as Cyra moved swiftly, her steps silent. Elias, despite his injuries, kept pace as best as he could. "Where are we going?" he asked under his breath. "There's an old cargo transport in the lower levels," Cyra whispered back. "If we can reach it before the morning shift rotation, we can get off this planet." Elias let out a weak chuckle. "You say that like it's easy. It's not," Cyra admitted. A sudden noise made them both freeze. "Drek patrol." Cyra pressed Elias against the wall, her sharp hearing picking up their conversation. "Final orders to clear out prisoners. The human is scheduled for execution within the hour." Elias exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Guess you got me out just in time." Cyra didn't respond. She was still coming to terms with what she had done. She had disobeyed her people, betrayed them. And for what? For one human. For the human who would not die. She glanced at Elias, studying him. His face was bruised, his body still healing, yet he stood with the same defiance as before. And suddenly, she knew why she had done it. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if her people were the strongest in the galaxy. Maybe strength wasn't about power. Maybe it was something else. Something Elias had. The first kill she regretted. The patrol moved on, and Cyra led Elias deeper into the outpost. Every step was dangerous. Every breath could be their last. Then, as they turned a corner, they came face to face with a lone Drek soldier. The moment of hesitation was brief, but it was enough. The soldier's eyes widened, and his hand flew to his communicator. Cyra reacted on instinct. She struck first. Her blade sliced through his armor, and he collapsed without a sound. For a moment, she stood over him, breathing heavily. She had killed before, countless times. But this time, it felt different. She had just killed one of her own. She looked at Elias. He wasn't judging her. He just nodded. "Keep moving." And so they did. Trust is earned in blood. They reached the lower levels, the scent of fuel and metal thick in the air. The old cargo transport was in sight, their way out. But there was a problem. A security panel blocked access to the docking bay. Cyra moved quickly, typing in a code, but the screen flashed red. "Damn it," she hissed. They've locked the system. Deadliest frowned. Can you override it? I can try. She worked quickly, her fingers flying over the controls. The Drex would notice the breach soon. Elias leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Why are you doing this? He asked suddenly. Cyra didn't look at him. You ask too many questions. Well, forgive me for wanting to know why the enemy is helping me escape. She hesitated before answering. I don't know. Elias let out a quiet laugh. Honest. I like that. The control panel beeped. Access granted. Come on, she said, opening the door. They slipped inside the docking bay, moving toward the transport. Cyra felt a strange energy in the air, something she had never felt before. It wasn't fear. It was trust. And she wasn't sure which scared her more. The chase begins. As the transport's engines roared to life, the alarms blared. They had been discovered. Drex soldiers poured into the hangar, weapons drawn. Cyra and Elias sprinted toward the ship, dodging blaster fire as they ran. Cyra turned and fired back, her aim precise, taking down 2 soldiers before ducking behind cover. Elias grabbed a fallen weapon and returned fire, his movements sharp despite his injuries. For the first time, they were fighting together. Cyra caught herself glancing at him. Despite everything, despite the pain, the exhaustion, the impossible odds, he was still fighting. And she realized something else. So was she. Not for her people, not for her mission, for him. The ship's door finally opened, and they sprinted inside. Cyra jumped into the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls. Elias collapsed into the co-pilot's chair, breathing hard. Tell me you know how to fly this thing. Cyra smirked. Better than you, human. The engines roared, and the ship lifted off just as the Drex fired a barrage of energy blasts. The shields flickered under the impact, but the transport held together. They escaped. The outpost shrank behind them as they blasted into the sky, leaving the burning city behind. Cyra exhaled, staring at the vast emptiness of space ahead. She had done it. She had betrayed her people, and she felt more free than she ever had before. Elias turned to her, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but also something else. Gratitude. So, he said, what now? Cyra looked at the endless stars ahead of them. Now, they ran. Now, they survived. Now, they fought together. The chase begins. Cyra had betrayed her people. The moment she had freed Elias from his cell, she had made an unthinkable choice, saving the human instead of obeying the Drex. Now, there was no turning back. Their stolen transport ship rocketed through the darkness of space, its engines burning hot as they fled from the ruined human colony. Behind them, the Drek warships were already mobilizing. The hunt had begun. Cyra gripped the controls, pushing the ship's speed to its limits. Elias sat in the co-pilot's chair, his body tense, but his mind sharp. How long until they catch up? He asked. Cyra's yellow eyes flicked to the scanners. Too soon. Minutes, she said grimly. Maybe less. Elias exhaled and tightened his seatbelt. Great, just enough time to start panicking. Cyra didn't respond. She was too focused, too aware of the consequences of her actions. Her people would never stop hunting her now. The hunters close in. Alarms blared inside the cockpit. Cyra cursed under her breath as 3 Drek warships appeared on the scanners, closing in fast. They're hailing us, Elias said, watching the flashing signals on the control panel. Cyra didn't answer. She already knew what the message would be. Surrender or die. A deep voice boomed through the speakers. Cyra, you have one chance. Power down your ship. Turn in the human. Your betrayal will be forgiven. It was Commander Varric. Cyra's grip tightened around the controls. Lies. The Drex never forgave traitors. If she surrendered, she and Elias would both be executed. She turned to Elias. I hope you're ready to fight. Elias smirked. I was born ready. Then the warships opened fire. A battle in the stars. Energy blasts screamed through the void, narrowly missing their ship. Cyra swerved, dodging and weaving between the enemy fire. Elias scrambled to the weapons controls, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar interface. Please tell me this thing has guns. Cyra flicked a switch. Not great ones, but they'll have to do. Elias grinned. That's good enough for me. He grabbed the targeting controls and aimed at the nearest Drek warship. With a quick pull of the trigger, the ship's twin cannons fired, striking one of the pursuing vessels. The shields absorbed most of the damage, but it was enough to make them pull back. They're not used to fighting someone who shoots back, Elias said. Cyra smirked despite herself. Then let's give them a fight they'll remember. She yanked the controls, sending the ship into a barrel roll just as another blast nearly clipped their wing. The gravity inside the cockpit shifted violently, but Elias held firm. Another enemy warship moved to flank them. We're boxed in, Elias shouted. Cyra's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them, and they couldn't fight them head-on. They needed a plan. Fast. Then she saw it. A dense asteroid field loomed ahead, its massive rocks tumbling through space in chaotic patterns. Hold on, she warned. Elias's eyes widened. Wait, are we seriously doing this? Cyra didn't answer. She just punched the throttle. Through the gauntlet. The transport ship dove into the asteroid field, weaving between the massive floating boulders. The Drek warships hesitated before following. Elias gritted his teeth. This is insane. Cyra's voice was calm. It's our only chance. The enemy ships fired blindly, but their blasts either missed or struck asteroids instead. The field was too dense, too unpredictable. One of the Drek ships made a mistake. A spinning asteroid the size of a skyscraper smashed into its hull, tearing it apart in an instant. Elias whooped. That's one down. Cyra's expression remained focused. 2 more to go. She twisted the ship through a narrow gap between 2 massive asteroids, the hull scraping against jagged rock. The alarms blared, but she didn't slow down. Another warship tried to follow, and clipped its wing against an asteroid. The impact sent it spiraling out of control, crashing into another rock and exploding in a bright fireball. Elias threw his arms up. 2 down. Cyra spared him a quick glance. Now comes the hard part. The last Drek warship was still on their tail. A desperate gamble. The asteroid field was thinning. They were running out of places to hide. Cyra scanned the sensors. One last shot. Ahead, she saw a large asteroid split down the middle, creating a narrow, unstable passageway. Too tight for a Drek warship. She made her decision in an instant. Hold your breath, she muttered. Elias's eyes widened. Why? Cyra didn't explain. She just angled the ship toward the gap and accelerated. The passage was dangerously tight. The ship barely fit. The walls scraped against the hull. Sparks flew. The entire cockpit shook violently. Elias clutched his seat. Cyra, we're gonna. And then, they burst out the other side. The Drek warship was too big to follow. It tried to slow down, but it was too late. The massive asteroid collapsed inward, crushing the warship between its rocky walls. Silence. Only the sound of their ship's engines remained. Elias let out a shaky laugh. Holy hell. Cyra finally exhaled, her muscles tense from the adrenaline. They had escaped. For now. Nowhere left to run. The ship floated in the quiet void of space. They were free, but they were far from safe. Cyra checked the fuel levels. Low. The damage report. Severe. They needed to land. Soon. Elias leaned back, rubbing his face. So, do you have a plan, or are we just winging it? Cyra hesitated. For the first time, she didn't know what came next. They couldn't go back. The Dreks would hunt them across the stars. and if they were caught, there would be no mercy. She turned to Elias. "There's one place we might go, a world where the Drex won't follow." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" Cyra's expression darkened. "Because they're afraid of it." Elias grinned. "Now I'm interested." Cyra set the coordinates. The ship turned toward a distant, uncharted planet on the edge of the galaxy, a place where they might stand a chance, a place where their fight was just beginning. The last stand. Cyra had never run before. Her whole life, she had been the hunter, not the prey. She had stood on battlefields, watched enemies fall before her, and never once felt the sting of fear. But now, as she and Elias sped toward an uncharted planet, she knew the truth. She wasn't running from the Drex. She was running toward something bigger than herself, something worth fighting for, a world of shadows. The planet loomed ahead, a swirling mass of deep green and dark blue, covered in thick, endless forests. It had no name on any Drek map, just a warning. Unstable, hostile, a graveyard for those who enter. Cyra's people feared this place. They whispered about it in hushed tones, calling it cursed, unnatural. And that was exactly why she had chosen it. Elias, sitting beside her in the cockpit, stared at the growing planet with a wary expression. "You sure about this?" Cyra's fingers tightened around the ship's controls. "No." Elias chuckled. "Well, that makes two of us." They were both exhausted. Their bodies bore the scars of their escape, the desperate fight through the asteroid field, the injuries that had not yet fully healed. But they had no choice. Behind them, the Drek fleet was searching. Ahead of them, the unknown. Cyra chose the unknown. With a deep breath, she angled the ship toward the planet and descended, a crash landing into the abyss. The moment they hit the atmosphere, everything went wrong. The ship trembled violently, alarms blaring as heat flared against the hull. The control panel flickered, sparks flying as Cyra struggled to keep them steady. Engines failing. Elias shouted. Cyra gritted her teeth. "Hold on." The ship spun wildly, careening toward the surface. Below them, the dark forest stretched for miles, an ocean of twisted trees and endless mist. Cyra fought the controls, using every bit of her skill to slow their descent. But it wasn't enough. They hit the ground hard. Metal screeched, trees snapped, and the world turned into chaos. When the dust settled, they were alive. Barely. The deadly silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. Cyra was the first to stir. Her body ached, but nothing was broken. She turned to Elias. He was slumped against his seat, breathing but unconscious. A thin trail of blood trickled down his forehead. Cyra cursed under her breath and unbuckled herself, stumbling as she stood. The ship was wrecked. Smoke curled from the consoles, and outside, thick vines had already begun creeping over the hull. This planet was alive, and it was watching them. A low growl echoed from the trees. Cyra tensed. They weren't alone. The hunt begins. She grabbed her weapon and stepped outside. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of damp earth and something rotten. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their twisted branches dripping with strange, pulsing vines. The ground beneath her feet felt too soft, like stepping on something that was breathing. Another growl. Closer. Cyra spun just as a shadow lunged from the trees. A beast, massive and reptilian, its skin covered in dark, jagged scales, eyes that burned with unnatural hunger. Cyra moved on instinct. She rolled aside just as the creature's claws sliced through the air, barely missing her. She fired her blaster, but the energy bolt had no effect. The creature didn't just resist the shot, it absorbed it. Cyra's heart pounded. What kind of monster was this? Then she heard more movement. Dozens of glowing eyes blinked open in the darkness. They were surrounded. Elias wakes up in a nightmare. Inside the wreckage, Elias stirred. His head throbbed, and everything was a blur. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The second thing was the distant roar of an unknown creature. That got him moving. He forced himself to sit up, groaning. His body protested, but he had felt worse. He unbuckled himself and stumbled toward the open hatch. What he saw made his blood run cold. Cyra stood alone, facing at least 6 towering beasts, their bodies rippling with unnatural energy. Predators, hunters, and she was out of time. Elias didn't think. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a Drek plasma rifle, and charged into the fight. The last stand. Cyra had no escape. The creatures circled, their hunger almost intelligent. They were waiting, testing her. Then, suddenly, gunfire. A blast slammed into the nearest beast's eye, making it howl in pain. Another shot tore through the vines above, sending a heavy branch crashing down on 2 others. Elias. Cyra didn't hesitate. She attacked. Together, they fought like they had never fought before. Elias moved with raw instinct, his every shot precise. Cyra's movements were fluid, deadly, unstoppable. But the creatures kept coming. They were relentless. Then, a howl unlike any before. The creatures froze. From the darkness, something bigger emerged. Cyra's blood went cold. This wasn't just a predator. This was their alpha. A fateful decision. They couldn't win. Not like this. Cyra grabbed Elias's arm. We need to move. Now. Elias didn't argue. They ran, pushing through the dense jungle, the monstrous creatures right behind them. Every second was a battle to survive. Every breath was a fight against exhaustion. Then, up ahead, a ruined structure. Ancient, massive. Cyra didn't know what it was, but it was their only chance. They dove inside, just as the beasts lunged, and something sealed the entrance behind them. Darkness swallowed them. Silence fell, and then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. Welcome, survivors. You are not the first, but you may be the last. Cyra and Elias exchanged a look. This planet had secrets, and they had just stumbled into its heart. The legend of Cyra and Elias. Darkness surrounded them. Cyra's breathing was steady, controlled, but her mind raced. What had just happened? One moment, she and Elias had been running for their lives. The next, an unseen force had sealed them inside this massive, ancient structure. And then, the voice. Welcome, survivors. You are not the first, but you may be the last. Elias, still gripping his plasma rifle, turned slowly, scanning the pitch-black room. Tell me I didn't just imagine that. You didn't, Cyra muttered. The walls glowed faintly, as if responding to their presence. Slowly, the chamber lit up, revealing intricate carvings etched into the stone. Symbols neither of them recognized. Cyra's heart pounded. This place. This wasn't just a ruin. It was something far older, far more dangerous. And they were not alone. A meeting with the forgotten. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Tall, cloaked in flowing, tattered robes, a face obscured by a smooth metallic mask. The voice spoke again, low and measured. Ancient, you have come here seeking refuge, it said, but there is no safety left in this galaxy. Cyra tightened her grip on her weapon. Who are you? The masked figure tilted its head slightly, a ghost of a forgotten war, a guardian of knowledge that no one remembers, a relic, much like this place. Elias raised an eyebrow. Sounds dramatic. The figure ignored him. Instead, its glowing eyes focused on Cyra. You are Drek, yet you walk with a human. Cyra's expression remained hard. Not anymore. There was a pause. Then the figure nodded. Then perhaps there is still hope. The lost truth of the Dreks. The figure gestured for them to follow. As they moved deeper into the ruins, Cyra's senses remained sharp, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. But what choice did they have? Outside, the monstrous predators still waited. And beyond that, the Drek fleet was still hunting them. Finally, they reached a central chamber, a massive circular hall, its walls lined with holographic records, flickering with data so old that it barely held together. The figure turned to Cyra. "You do not yet understand why you are here," it said. "But the truth is this. Your people were never meant to rule the galaxy." Cyra's fists clenched. "That's a lie." "Is it?" The figure motioned toward one of the glowing archives. A vision appeared, a history lost to time. She saw images of her ancestors, not as conquerors, but as something else. Once, long ago, the Dreks had been warriors of honor, not destruction. But something had changed. A war, a betrayal, a shift in their beliefs that had twisted their entire civilization. They were not always the way they are now, the figure continued. Your people once stood for something greater. But power, unchecked, unchallenged, has turned them into what they are today. Cyra's hands shook. She had spent her entire life believing in the strength of the Dreks, their supremacy. But this changed everything. Elias, standing beside her, crossed his arms. "So what you're saying is, the Dreks were the good guys once?" The figure nodded. Elias let out a low whistle. That's one hell of a history book they left out of your training." Cyra shot him a glare, but she couldn't argue. For the first time, she wondered, had she been fighting for the wrong side all along? The war that would come. A deep rumble echoed through the structure. The figure turned sharply. "They are here." Cyra's heart dropped. The Dreks. The figure shook its head. Worse. The holograms flickered, revealing something more terrifying than the Drek fleet. A new enemy. A race even the Dreks feared. A race that had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And now, because of Cyra and Elias's escape, that moment had come. The figure turned to them, its glowing eyes burning with urgency. "You must leave this place. Now." Elias frowned. "Not sure if you noticed, but we don't exactly have a working ship anymore." The figure stepped aside, revealing the hidden hangar. Inside, resting on an ancient platform, was a sleek, advanced starship. Cyra's breath caught. "That ship," she whispered, "it's Drek technology." "Older than that," the figure corrected. "It was built before your people fell, a time when they were not conquerors, but protectors." Elias grinned. "I don't care what it is as long as it flies." Cyra hesitated. "What happens if we leave?" The figure turned toward the ruins, toward the depths of the world that held secrets no one was meant to find. "Then you become what you were meant to be." Cyra glanced at Elias. He shrugged. "We've come this far. Might as well finish the story." She took a deep breath. Then she stepped onto the ship. The legend begins. As the engines roared to life, the world around them shook. The moment they lifted off, the jungle below erupted in chaos. The creatures outside howled, the ruins began to collapse, and from the skies, Drek warships appeared. Elias cursed. "They're still on us." Cyra's hands flew over the controls. "Then let's show them why they should have left us alone." She punched the thrusters. The ancient ship exploded into the sky, faster than anything she had ever piloted. The Dreks chased them, but this time, Cyra wasn't running. This time, she was fighting. And as the first blast fired from their ship, cutting through the enemy like a blade through the dark, a legend was born. Epilogue. The unbreakable ones. They became something new. Cyra and Elias, once enemies, now hunted together, fought together, survived together. The galaxy whispered their names. The traitor and the human. The ones who defied an empire. But to those who truly knew them, they were simply the ones who refused to break. And in a universe ruled by fear, that made them the most dangerous force of all. The war was coming, but this time, Cyra and Elias wouldn't be running. They would be leading the charge. The fight had just begun.